Hello everyone. So today for US history, we're going to be talking about what is some terminology associated with the study of history itself. So in class, these are a lot of the words we're going to be using quite often, not so much to talk about the content of history, but to talk about the study of history and what historians do. You also are going to have an essay assigned that requires you to use this terminology in order to use the words that actual historians use instead of what history students use. So I'm going to set up what this terminology is, and at the very end, there's going to be the directions for the essay. That set of directions is also in your packet. Speaking of your packet, you should be getting that out. There is a page that says at the top, defining history terminology. It has the terms listed there. You just need to write in the definitions that are on the screen for the credit so you have them yourself and to show that you kind of processed it along the way. All right, so let's talk about this stuff. Firstly, when we talk about the study of history, history is really not so much what happened, but the study of what happened. And that's going to be a little bit different depending on what you look at, what you're taking into consideration. So if it's just what happened, history can go all the way back to what we know about what happened. But when we talk about history, we can actually only go back to when people started to record this stuff and think about that it was useful to set down what happened and what people's experiences were. And those people are called historians, right? No big deal. You've no doubt heard that word. It makes complete sense, but I want to tell you specifically what a historian is because there's sometimes some misconceptions about that. So a historian is a professional who uses specialized skills to study what happened in the past. So not so much what happened, remember, but the study of what happened. Historians are professionals who do that for a living. So historians are not the same thing as history buffs, so people who just like knowing things about history. And that's not the same thing even as a history teacher or a history student. Historians do this for a living. They understand what they're doing very closely, and they're the ones that we should trust much more so than the average person when it comes to studying history, because this is their job, this is what they love, this is what they've been trained in. All right, now, what do historians often use? Two big things. One is called a primary source. The word primary means first. So a primary source is a document, potentially a physical object that was written or created during the time that you're actually studying. So if we're looking at some of the early stuff that we're studying in class, like Christopher Columbus, then that means that his diary entry would be a primary source. It was something that was created when he was actually existing. So it's not something that was written by a historian about him, but rather what was actually created at the time. Now, another type of source is a secondary source. So you can see that's kind of coming secondhand, not firsthand, secondhand. Still documents, images, physical objects created about an event or an era way, way, way long after it happened from an outsider's point of view. So the person that writes a secondary source is typically not someone that lived through it because they are their own person and they have their own experiences, and that would be a primary source. A secondary source would be a historian. Think of when we looked at Christopher Columbus as well. Remember, that involved Howard Zinn, James Loewen, right? Those are historians. They study primary sources and other secondary sources. They create their own work, and that is the secondary source. They exist in a modern time, not back when it actually happened. Okay, in class, we're going to be looking at a lot of primary sources and secondary sources, so be aware of what those terms are. All right, so next term that we've got is sort of what is the process of studying history? And part of this has to do with perspective. Now, every single person has a perspective or a way of looking at events, a way of looking at history itself. So you can use the words perspective and point of view pretty interchangeably. In this class, we're often not going to be talking about one perspective or point of view, but multiple perspectives or points of view, so we can understand what different people thought about the same event that we're considering. Now, perspective is important because you consider what different people think, but you've got to be careful that people's perspectives and kind of their thoughts and opinions, their interpretation, doesn't turn into bias. right? Now, I do want to make the distinction here that the word bias is a noun. If you add the letters ed to the end of bias, you get biased, which is the adjective. So a person can be biased, but they have a bias or a prejudice. This means that they have pretty extreme preference towards one point of view. It's often based on their own experience and personal previous beliefs. That doesn't mean that's a bad thing, but it's always important to consider, does someone have such a strong perspective on something that it makes them biased, which means that you have to be careful about considering, can I trust this source because they're so dedicated to their perspective that they're not considering anybody else's perspective. Right, so keep those in mind as we move ahead to see what can go wrong when we study history and look at sources. So, one process that historians inevitably have to make is they have to select some evidence to support what they're claiming in that secondary source. So, selection is the process of choosing events, ideas, evidence to include to support their interpretation or their perspective. Now, historians cannot avoid this because there is so much evidence about everything that they can only include some of it. Now, that's going to happen, but there's something related to this that can make it a problem, and it's the next term, and that's omission. So selection has to happen, but what happens when historians or anyone that has a perspective chooses to purposely leave out certain evidence that does not support their interpretation or their perspective? Omission is getting closer to bias, while selection is trying to be, not necessarily biased in one way. It has to happen. Omission is when someone says, I'm not looking for the answer to what happened, but I know the answer to what happened in my mind, and I'm only going to use evidence to support what I already believed happened. Selection is okay. Omission is a problem, because what happens with omission? Distortion. So distortion, you've probably seen the word distort before. It means to twist and change the shape of something. And that's what happens when historical interpretations omit evidence by specifically selecting only what they want to believe. And that creates a false or misleading account of history, because in the process of omitting a lot of evidence, they might be representing things in a way that they want to without ever acknowledging that other perspectives exist. That is our goal in this class, to say, here are all these perspectives. You're welcome to favor one, but you can't just discount a perspective and say, nope, that's completely invalid because I don't believe it. Right? You can say they believe this, you can question their use of evidence, but you can't just say, no, they're completely invalid because I don't like what they have to say. That's absolutely unacceptable in history. In history, we value evidence over perspective. So, trust perspectives that have a lot of evidence and reliable evidence. So this slide has been all about what can go wrong in the study of history. So next we need to talk about what can correct that in order to make sure that these things don't happen so that history does not become distorted. Okay, one of them is that historians, including you, budding historians in high school, need to assess the reliability of sources, primary or secondary sources. You look at the source and you say, to what extent can I trust the information that this source is providing? So you could think about, do they have a reputation that is associated with a certain political bias? Do they only ever write about one topic? Do they have a degree in that topic, or are they just a history buff who enjoys the study, but not really so dedicated that they're willing to look at more aspects of it? Reliability is about trust, and I want you in this class to basically trust no one. Look at every source and don't just accept that it is telling you the truth, but look at the author, decide what is their background, what could be their bias, and is that bias extreme enough that it's going to affect their reliability. So basically, I want you to question absolutely everything. That includes the textbook. That includes me. Please do that in class. It's fun. Another thing that historians do in order to avoid that potential distortion is that they contextualize the things they're studying. So context is sort of what's going on around the creation of a source. So this was created in a certain year by a certain person detailing a certain event, right? But that's just one specific thing. What's the bigger picture? what were other sources being created? What did people tend to believe in that era? So what were their ideas on democracy, on liberty? What were their ideas on the way society should be run? All that affects how perspectives are developed within their own era, and thus it affects whether something is reliable. You basically try to figure out with the context what could be the author's bias so that you know how to approach and how to read what they have to say. So this is kind of a difficult skill because it's not going to be something you can just figure out from reading the source. You have to go beyond the source and think about other things you've read and learned and to make connections between the source and all those other things. So it's difficult, but we'll do lots of practice with it. Lastly, something that historians do is corroboration. So we talk about looking at sources like primary sources, like secondary sources, but we never look at them just one source in isolation. That is what would happen if we just read the textbook. But I've already told you guys that is not what we're going to do. You're going to have to corroborate multiple sources that could include the textbook at times, but more often saying, well, primary sources, what did people believe at the time? What were the different possible beliefs that people had? And say, all right, what is the trend between these beliefs? What was similar about them, or what was different? How can it be possible that two people from the same era that grew up in the exact same context have such different beliefs and opinions about the same exact topic? Things that we've looked at. Remember the diary entry from Columbus? But then also that passage from Bartolome de las Casas that said basically what happened to the natives was unacceptable and cruel. Meanwhile, Columbus was saying this would be great for us. Two very different perspectives by men that lived in the same exact time period. That's difficult to corroborate, to say, how can this happen? So you define those differences and then you say, all right, we can separate it into different interpretations of history based on the different evidence. You recognize that both are based on evidence, so both are valued, but it's up to you to decide which perspective and which interpretation fits closer to your own ideas and perspective, your own biases. But always recognize the other side. And if you don't disagree with them, make sure to have evidence to say why you disagree with them. Don't just say, I disagree with them, cause. Make sure you're ready to defend yourself. All right, so let's talk about that essay that you're going to have to write using these terms and using the stuff that we're learning in class across this first unit. So directions, this essay is going to be 1 to 2 pages long. So it's really not that extensive, but you're going to be defining what is history, defining history in a sense. So all the terms that I have talked about on this slideshow, those need to be used within this essay itself, not in any particular order, not necessarily in the exact story the way I told it, but you do need to use all of them. Okay, when you use the terms, you need to either underline them or bold them for identification so I can easily tell that, yes, you are using the terms, you are using the language that historians use to talk about history. Note, you got to use all the terms. You can use different forms of the word, so omit for omission, select for selection. I already told you about the difference between bias and biased, right? So make sure you can use the different forms, but make sure you're using them correctly. It counts against you a little bit if you haven't used the word correctly. It shows you don't quite know what it means if you're not using it right. So essay should reflect that you're understanding the course content through the examples you're using to support your definition of history. Use specific examples from class. So talk about Columbus, right? Talk about early colonization. Eventually we'll learn stuff like the Declaration of Independence, how different historians view what the Declaration meant in different ways. I want you to limit your evidence to what we study this first unit. So if you talk about stuff that you learned in world history or on your own time, it's not going to count towards evidence. I want you to select evidence based on the way we have learned it. All right? Lastly, this is all assigned through Google Classroom. It's already there. The formatting is already set to 1-inch margins, 12-point font, double space. Don't change it. If you change it, you're going to get a little markdown on it, because if you're altering those formatting options, then you're trying to get away with probably having a shorter essay, and that's really just not acceptable. All right, so if you have more questions about this essay in class, email me, come see me. I'm happy to answer any questions. Otherwise, remember, this is due at the end of the first unit on the day that we take the test. So work on that and get through that. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. I will see you in class very soon, and see you later.